Hello, and welcome to today's A-Team Group webinar on managing the transaction reporting landscape post-Brexit. My name's Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor at A-Team Group, and I will moderate today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Silvano Stagni, a member of the FIX Sfdr working group, Melanie Bristow, a director at UBS, Joseph Byrne, a privacy solutions engineer at OneTrust, Tom Wozorek, a managing director at Univista at the London Stock Exchange Group, and Ron Finberg, business development for global reporting at IHS Markit. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in just a few minutes. Meantime, just a little bit of information about how you can take part in the webinar today. On your screen, you'll see to the right of the video two panels, one for questions, one for polls. We'll run 3 polls today. They'll appear in that panel, and I'll let you know when you should be able to see them and remind you to fill them in. And obviously the question panel is for you to ask questions to our experts. Please feel free to ask those whenever you like. We'll take them throughout the webinar, as to save them to the end always means they get rather lost. So any questions, please place them there and we'll answer as many as we can. You can also access some of our other A-Team Group resources. You can register for our RegTech Summit virtual. You can download our latest regulatory data handbook, and you can also sign up for our next Brexit webinar that will review the regulatory landscape and the data management response. Okay, enough of me and over to our speakers. Silvano, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Silvano Stagni. I'm the co-chair of the FIX Sfdr working group, and I'm a consultant in regulatory change, working mostly with medium-sized and small financial institutions.
Excellent, lovely. Melanie.
Hi there, I'm Melanie Bristow. I've been in regulatory projects for the last 12 years, of which 5 of these years have been spent in UBS covering the SIM implementation and Sfdr now EMEA refit. Transaction reporting for me has been a bit of a pool with syrup, vastly underestimated and sticky to get through now. So happy to be participating today.
Thank you, Joseph.
Hi, I'm Joseph Byrne, a solutions engineer at OneTrust. My typical role revolves around describing how the OneTrust platform can meet people's privacy goals. That's a platform that delivers privacy, security, and governance. I also get to take part in events like this, talking about issues in the privacy space. So yeah, delighted to be here.
Thank you very much indeed. And coming to you, Tom.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tom Wozorek. I head up product management at Univista. So that's basically business ownership of our regulated and non-regulated solutions in the regulatory reporting space.
Thank you. And Ron.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm Ron Finberg from Product and Regulatory Specialist at IHS Markit. Previous to that, I was with Capitec for 5 years, which recently got acquired by IHS Markit. We're in the regulatory reporting space, helping firms with Sfdr and MIRA, etc.
Okay, that's great. Thank you all very much. Let's get on with the discussion. We've got a lot to talk about. And coming to you first, Tom, what are the sort of broad transaction reporting requirements of the post-Brexit UK regulatory regime?
So I'm going to stick to the term transaction reporting and assume that you mean MiFID II reporting. And for that, I think in preparation for Brexit, there were a few things that let's call them kind of unintended consequences of the separation between the regulators. And really it comes down to the fact that post-Brexit, the FCA and the European regulators currently don't share any data. So all that infrastructure that was built up for them to be able to exchange data between each other, to keep track of what's going on in each other's market, all of that is gone. And unfortunately, for many firms, that means additional infrastructure and additional requirements. So we had things such as what we call duplicate reporting. You know, you have to take the same copy of the transaction and report it to the FCA, perhaps one of the European regulators, depending on how your branch setup worked, etc. We had things such as a third-party venue reporting for venue members. So if you're a UK firm and you're a direct member of an EU venue, that venue now has to report on your behalf, and vice versa. If you're a European broker and you're trading as a direct member of LSEG, one of our venues, you have to report both to your home regulator, and LSEG needs to report on your behalf. So all of a sudden, all these members had to provide all kinds of data to the venues that they never had to do before, and venues themselves had to develop the infrastructure to be able to report on behalf of their non-MiFID firms now. So those are just some examples, but I think there were quite a few just kind of operational block and tackle things that we had to do in order to put all the infrastructure in place and be ready. Now, luckily, and some people might argue it wasn't luckily, but we had a couple of goes at it. Brexit date got announced. We all did all the frantic preparation. It then got postponed. We all kind of breathed a sign of the relief. And again, we went through that process 2 or 3 times. So the final one was, I think, fairly smooth. I'll be curious about what other people on the panel think. But we're now sort of in a steady state. And I think everybody's taking stock and awaiting perhaps some sort of, if not equivalency, then some sort of a data sharing arrangement between the regulators. So perhaps we can unwind some of the more cumbersome bits that we had to do.
Okay, let's hope for that. But meantime, Ron, how do you see the sort of top level, the big challenges and the big requirements that came in?
So I think just adding to what Tom said, it's really the name of the game is really just the dual reporting. So he mentioned about MiFID, and the same thing applies for the transaction reporting under EMIR and SFDR. Luckily, the FCA basically did a copy paste of everything that ESMA had involved. So actually getting up and being able to report was nothing new, but it just had to do what Tom mentioned, just like the larger infrastructure issues about how to do it. And then it just, since then it's just minor little issues that people are encountering. For example, about how to track eligibility on 2 different tracks in the future. So it's more of, I think it's less about how to do the reporting, and now just how can we deal with a split regime, which is more or less the same, and being able to keep in mind all the little differences the divergences that are going to be taking place in the future.
Okay, Ron, staying with you, let's look a bit more specifically at which regulations have been changed and what the adjusted transaction reporting requirements are looking like.
So I think one item that I just wanted to point out in terms of the changes is within MiFID, there are a lot of firms have, what they've done is they've taken 2 different, they've created both a UK and an EU entity, and in those situations, it's a lot easier just kind of to review what needs to be reported where. You have your UK stuff goes to UK, the EU's in EU. However, there's a number of companies that have also taken the single review, the single approach, where they'll have one main entity, and instead of having a separately fully licensed entity, they'll work on branches. And what takes place with branches is you run into this duplicate reporting where, for example, if your main branch is in the UK, if you're regulated in the UK, and now you're opening up a branch in Spain or Germany, you're suddenly having to report those same trades that you're doing in the UK as well for Germany and Spain. And this is one item that I think people were overlooking, because they believed, okay, if my main company, if I didn't get a full license in a different country, I don't have to report twice. But now they're realizing that they are following this. So branches is, I'd probably say, one of the immediate areas where people have realized that there's suddenly like a reporting requirement that they didn't expect to have, for post-Brexit.
Okay, thank you. Tom, are there particular regulations that have changed rather dramatically in terms of the UK regime?
So I think Ron mentioned EMIR and SFDR, and as you rightfully say, FCA was pragmatic enough to just carbon copy the regulations into UK law. But inevitably, there are slight differences. So, because the venues are different, the universe of what's eligible to reporting is different between the FCA and Europe, etc. The devil is in the details, and all of those need to be adjusted. And in addition to those big kind of branded regulations, we also operate a number of smaller services. So commodities position reporting, reference data reporting, if you're a systematic internalizer or you run a venue, all the systematic internalizer reference data, etc. Just a lot of them needed small little adjustments. in order to make sure that everything works properly. There's one more kind of double reporting scenario that's just coming up, and we have a couple of tier one firms requested, and that's actually based on transmissions of order. So imagine you're a UK bank and you don't want to open up a branch in a EU country, but you have a broker over there that deals with local clients and then transmits the orders back to be executed in London. And so while it hasn't happened yet, we've heard from some European regulators that they might allow a scenario like that to allow UK firms to continue service their market and grant them an investment license. But again, they will require a copy of anything that gets transmitted to London to be executed, reported to themselves. And again, you're falling into this scenario where the same transaction needs to go to two regulators. One might accept it, one might reject it, one might inquire into it, the other might not. You know, just the operational overhang of all of this is quite burdensome. But it's like the tail wagging the dog. You know, these operational considerations probably don't really drive the business strategy of how firms want to go to market and service their customers post-Brexit. So we're just kind of, I don't want to say stuck, because I think it's a great opportunity to provide a service, but we're here kind of mopping it all up and making sure that it all works post-Brexit.
Okay, that's lovely. Melanie, let me bring you in here. And how did these new kinds of requirements differ to the EU regime? I think SFTR and the EMIR refit are your specialist areas.
Ooh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. Yes. So, I mean, specifically, I think the key difference that has been covered by Tom and Ron in general is the divergence of their reporting to the different trade repositories. In the event that you have an instance where you have both EU and FCA jurisdiction trades in the same space, you would have to report them to two different entities. That's clearly divergence. It is essentially copy and paste, still required additional work, right? And we still see some of the sort of results of that, in that, for example, trades that have paid previously or cross-matching, all of that gets impacted by this new activity. You now have a scenario where you don't have to share UTIs across jurisdiction, because essentially you now single-sided reporting. So where we had some strict limitations set internally, I have to say by choice, it would be we wouldn't agree to trade with an entity if there is no UTI sharing strategy. It kind of have loosened some of the requirements around that, if I can put it that way. Another place where I saw a specific divergence is around NFCs not have to go live with phase 4 in the FCA jurisdiction. So non-financial counterparties did not have to adhere to phase 4 under the FCA, which took out of scope the requirement to do mandatory delegated reporting as well. So that is a specific requirement. I think some firms may have been better off, some firms may have been worse off because of it, but nonetheless, it's a difference. It has definitely meant that from that point forward, we'll have a difference between the application of SFTR under the FCA and under EU. I think other areas are, how do you get rid of your stale data and TRs? There's been some neglection in terms of providing further guidance on getting rid of certain style data. I don't want to go into the specifics, but there's all that type of minor details that are still actually being worked through afterwards. I think as we look at time, going by, as we look ahead into the future, we'll see more divergence, especially in the SFTR space. One of the items coming up soon is ally of the issuer. I would like to understand what's going to happen in this particular space. there has been reprieve for non-EEA entities to not have an ally for issuers of securities. And currently we are applying that across both the FCA and the EU. What's going to happen going forward? ESMA has written a letter on behalf of, sorry, not ESMA, the trade associations has written a letter to ESMA explaining that there will be a significant impact in this space. If there is, it's also been sent to the FCA, if there is going to be an adjustment of dates or further reprieve or an acceptance of rejections or advice on how to treat this situation, I would like to know whether it's going to be the same for the FCA and the EU. So I think this is the first test. And then following that up on EMEA refit side, EMEA refit is only in the position of having a draft RTS at this point in time. Therefore, because this is after Brexit, even though the FCA have adopted EMEA before as part of the EU, they have not formally adopted EMEA refit. So therefore, only EU entities are currently in scope. We are expecting that some type of announcement explaining, probably saying that EMEA refit should be adopted in the UK jurisdiction, but we don't know yet. And the longer we wait, the more chances there are of going live at different times and going live with different requirements.
Okay. Silvano, anything to add to what Melis
Yes,
said?
there is also what I call the slippery slope of differences. EMEA regularly publishes Q&A, and there is an SFDR Q&A paper that was published post-Brexit. Now, technically, the FCA is not bound by whatever the EMEA decides to answer to one of the questions. So there is the risk of what I call a creeping difference, because the FCA and EMEA interpret an issue in a different way. What Melanie was saying about the LEI of the issuer is an example, but you could have a number of them, especially with SFDR, which should we say shines at times shines for its darkness.
Okay. We'll see how brightly it can shine then. Okay, that's great. I have a couple of audience questions already. And Melanie, can I come to you with the first one? You mentioned delegated reporting. Could you explain a little bit more about delegated reporting under EMEA and why some banks have suspended this, and is this a good idea? Is that not something you've heard of?
So under EMEA, to be honest, within this, I have not heard that some banks have suspended delegated reporting under EMEA. So I apologize, but I don't think I'm the right person for this question.
Fine. Savannah?
Sorry, there is a practical issue on delegated reporting under SFDR, which, to my knowledge, some medium sized institution, but not banks, more on the buy side, have suspended because they're now, with the non-financial counterparties not being subject to SFDR here, there are differences in dealing with a EU non-financial counterparty and with the UK in terms of reporting. And also, when you actually when the delegating party has manages funds based in the EU from the UK, there are potential issues that have led to a number of companies suspending them. potential issue being it's the jurisdiction of the fund that drives the reporting, not the jurisdiction of the fund manager.
Yeah.
And SFDR doesn't have the country of the reporting counterparty. There's only the country of the other counterparty. So it can lead to issues, and therefore there are companies that have suspended that to be on the safe side.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. Here's a rather technical question, if anybody wants to jump in. If not, we'll take it offline and answer it later. And it is, NCA rejections for whatever reason still pending to be reported as of the 1st of January 2021 now need to be reported to the new regulators UK to UK, EU to EU, or do these still need to be submitted to their original destination?
I can probably take that one. So
Thanks, Tom.
whenever we come up with this question, we basically say you need to think pre-Brexit for pre-Brexit trading dates and post-Brexit for post-Brexit trading dates. So if you misreported something pre-Brexit and you owe it to a pre-Brexit regulator, then that's probably where they should go. Yeah, even though your current obligation post-January the 1st might have changed.
Okay, that's lovely. One more for you, Melanie. This was an easy one. Could you specify when the letter you mentioned about SFTR from the Trade Association was sent, and is it publicly available?
It should be published on the websites of ISLA, ICMA, and I believe it's the FIA and another trade association that I can't recall off the top of my head, and potentially even acknowledged by ESMA on their website. So it should be publicly available. I don't see any problem with that. When was it done? It was last week. I don't know if it was Wednesday or Thursday.
Okay.
Last week was it.
That narrows it down nicely. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, that's a lot of questions. Let's run a poll question just because we can. And our first question asks, to what extent is your organisation increasing investment in compliance to support both the UK and EU transaction reporting environments? And you should be able to see that on your little panel to the right of your video. So if you'd like to place your votes now, well, I carry on asking the questions, and let me come to you, Silvano, first. Do you think there will be increased investment here to manage both sides of things?
I think so, because there are very few organizations that operate in a single jurisdiction, be it the UK or the EU. And also, if you think that the London office of a European bank before December had a reduced compliance requirement because the bulk of it was done at the home office in their country, and now they have a full compliance requirement because they have to report to the FCA as if they were a completely independent company, because they are. But also, I was mentioning earlier the creeping differences. There is a need to be very alert to any potential differences, because we've said that FCA has adopted a pragmatic attitude. So on January the 2nd, everything was the same. But although regulation have a kickoff date, regulation are tinkered with constantly. You have Q&As, you have opinions, you have decisions, and now there isn't a single authority that does that, but there are two. So you have, and last but not least, you have the people in the front line that need to be monitored under two logics, potentially, UK and EU, and that creates more compliance issues and probably will need compliance investment.
Okay, Melanie, do you see more investment here?
Absolutely. I don't think we have a choice. Clearly, there's the investment that results out of changes from the continued regulatory feedback. To Silvano's points, very good point. Q&As, guidelines get published probably annually, I think now. We also work on the basis of best practice through the industry, especially in SFTR. There's been a lot of work done there, and there's a lot of movement there still happening. On top of that, we have to think about the run the bank side of this. You need people that ensure that those controls remain once the program wraps up, and they incorporate those Q&As and ensure that when there's any significant impact, that the program teams are formed around it so that the job gets done. Yes, I absolutely see investment being required in this space. Absolutely.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's see what our audience says. Can we see the poll results, please? Thank you. Somewhat, yep. Significantly, not at all. Oh, a little, don't know. But yeah, somewhat is the general feeling. Melanie, does that sort of ring bells with you?
I think somewhat's underestimated.
Okay.
It feels low.
Yeah.
Okay. Ron, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, it's also a little surprising as well, because if you take into account just firms that have opened up new branches or entities in different countries, that's a somewhat large investment. So I would put that on a
Okay. All right, let's run another poll question to see what the challenges of the UK regime are, let alone what they cost. So can we run that poll, please? And while we're running that, and you are ticking your favorites, and you can tick as many options as you like on this one, let me come back to you, Ron, to talk about the data management and data governance challenges of the new regime.
Yeah, so I think just coming back to it a little bit about what Silvano was talking about, having, and Melanie, about having specialists in both, across both UK and EU. So one item that was kind of a reference a little bit before is typically you'll have one specific hub that's really managing it. So if you had if everything was out of the UK initially, and then you added a few different European branches, so everything is probably primarily going to be continue to be managed from that one UK source. However, just because it's 95% being managed out of there, it doesn't remove the obligations from the compliance officers in those European locations from having the tools and really making sure that they know what's being reported. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones responsible for sending these reports to their local NCA for EMIR, MiFID, and SFTR. So there is a need to have back and forth with the professionals who have been leading leading the reporting, having tools, having different insights, dashboards, having those type of control measures in place are very useful for being able to kind of control the data management in the future for dual reporting.
Thank you. Melanie, how have you sort of faced these kinds of challenges sort of on the ground, trying to keep everything going?
Yeah, I think so from a program perspective, because that's really my space, I think my position on this is always to be ready to support optionality. To the point around dual reporting, you might know a specific position now, you might find another position out later. You kind of need to plan ahead for that. Otherwise, you kind of tie yourself up in sort of ropes, not being able to respond adequately. Clearly, you need to maintain double data. You need to source it from relevant master data sources. It all results in increased cost building capacity. So we kind of have covered that point, but ultimately that's what it comes down to, is you are handling more data. There are subtle differences. You need to ensure that it comes from master authoritative sources. You need to have the right governance processes in place, and you need to do that in a way that doesn't feel like red tape.
Okay, that's great. Let's see the results of the poll on challenges, if we may. So efficient data management for dual reporting, that's something we've covered a lot. Lack of agility to implement changes quickly, sourcing additionally required data, shortfall in necessary budgets and resources. Nobody's saying no challenges. Well, Ron, let's come back to you for a comment on that poll result if we can.
Yeah, it looks more or less what we were talking about before. It's you know, it was good to see that it was a 0% for the no challenges.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed for that. And let's move on. And let me bring you in here, Joseph. Considering the issues of the post-Brexit transaction reporting, including the need for some firms to handle dual reporting, how can firms actually approach best practice management, data management, I should say?
Well, I think you absolutely need to deploy a system that's adaptable. From the conversations we've had so far, we've discussed there will be some initial divergence and perhaps more as we proceed, but there may be other changes further on. So if you don't have a system or an approach that you can scale and you can adapt, you're putting yourself in a difficult position. And hopefully you've got your tools aligned for one of the regulations or the UK. And with that, it's much easier to adapt. And we see this in privacy all the time as new regulations are introduced. If you've got your house in order, that pivot or that adapting is so much easier. So it'll set you up for the coming years and the coming changes. So I'd suggest in terms of best practices, implementing something that you know you can adapt to any future changes so you're not locked in. Okay,
that's lovely. Silvana, what would you say there in terms of how to approach this from a data management perspective?
I think that it ultimately boils down to getting the correct data to the correct place, bearing in mind that the duplication looks exactly identical. The difference can be very subtle. And if one of the things that, and the attention and the care needs to be constant across the whole workflow of data. If you like, it's going back to one of the shocks with the introduction of MiFID II, that all of a sudden people realized that they were not booking things with the right client because they had to use the right LEI. And you had HSBC that had over 2,000 legal entities or more. And you now see that to all the data. You have identical regulation, but the input is different. And the input is structured at the moment in the same way. But you need to be sure that you take the correct data from the correct place. In MiFID, there are two lists of instrument admitters to trading, one for the UK, one for the EU. They look exactly the same structurally. But you need to be sure that you get the data from the right one, because there is an impact on the way you report that transaction, if you need to report that transaction. And all of those things are very complex from a governance point, because if you blink, you make a mistake.
Okay, that's great. Tom, can I come to you? I'm going to sort of put a few audience questions together, so listen carefully. One is, how can we actually keep up with all the divergences in regulatory transaction reporting post-Brexit? And here's one which I'm not sure everybody will agree with. It says, when looking for guidance on issues, the FCA website generally just repoints people towards the ESMA documentation. Should we continue to follow the ESMA documentation?
Yeah. So look, two questions there. So I think the first question, and which is why we're all on this call, is that technology is the answer here, right? This is a very data-centric, detail-oriented, reference data in, bunch of rules, data out, IT process. I think the lucky thing about it all, I guess, luckily for us, is that there are a lot of vendors that can help, both with the technology and with the expertise and experience, or how to set up your process and how to have the systems and controls on top of it to make sure you're reporting correctly. And then as far as the FCA pointing at the ESMA documents, I got to be careful what I say here, but one of the slogans of Brexit was to take back control, right? And so I think now all of the UK prudential authorities have control. They started with an exact copy of the EU regulation, but inevitably they're going to mold them into whatever makes sense for UK, perhaps simplify them, hopefully, or make it more streamlined, etc. And so I think the best we can hope in the long term is I don't think we'll ever go back to the pre-Brexit state, but again, I keep coming back to equivalency. So the two regimes might be different, but hopefully we'll get to the point where if you report under one, it satisfies the other and vice versa. But that cost of having to manage two, because there will be differences, both to the rules and the reference data and the outputs and the processes required, I think that's here to stay. And as the FCA gets more mature and understands these regulations better, I mean, don't forget they're just starting in this new role of supervising all of these new trade repositories and arms. So they're gearing up as well. I'm sure they're going to forge their own path and do their own thing with the UK regulations.
Excellent. And just another quick question. I'll add this on to the end of that one. That conversation, Tom. Nothing from the FCA yet in terms of penalties for making mistakes and things like that. Is this still early days, or are they sitting there on the brink?
So again, I'm completely guessing here, but
I'll
come back to the comment that says that they also have a bit of a learning curve. They haven't supervised these entities before. But I can tell you that the FCA is quite active at looking at the content and the quality of the data that they received, despite of that. So they're gearing up, and they'll be knocking on doors sooner or later.
Melanie, what would you say on that then?
Yeah, I'm knocking on wood. Literally. It's like poking a lion that's sleeping. To Tom's point, I think in our experience, FCA is very much on top of things and have very skilled people that understand transaction reporting. We haven't heard much about how they've perceived, for example, SFTR's go live. I haven't heard much about that yet. I think there is still an element of, the sort of aftermath of going live, and that could be maybe, tolerance for about a year around getting it embedded. They must understand, and I believe most firms have fed back to them that we're not quite there yet on a number of the requirements that ESMA have asked us to implement. That's simply a result of getting guidelines on the 6th of January when you're going live on the 13th of July. It's simply, in some cases, not possible to implement technology that quickly and bring a brand new regulation on its feet. So I think they know we have work to do. They know that we are focused on it, and they see that we have the right attitude. I don't know. I don't think fines, if I have to guess, and this is sure, like proper guesstimate, I'm really not expecting much in terms of fines for the first couple of years. I think they will consult, have a look maybe after a year how firms are getting on and understand what's still outstanding. Like I say, there are still some open points where we are lacking clarity. And in some cases, it's not a question of not being willing. In some cases, it's a question of not being able to make a position. You just kind of need to create that position for yourself in some cases. But, I want to add to what Silvana said about the data just quickly before I hand back over is, one of the things I read recently is focus on the process, not the results. And that kind of speaks to me in terms of the data. We should be focusing on the processes that we have for the data, how we're sourcing it, the subtle differences, ensuring that we get it right. The result will then be correct. And hopefully then we won't have any fines. Fingers crossed.
Okay, good. Lots of work to do and perhaps a little bit of time without the FCA being too challenging. So let's run our last poll today, and it asks how you're approaching these kind of UK requirements. So could we see that poll, please? Lovely. And whilst you're thinking about that one, Tom, tell me a little bit about the kind of technologies, tools and services that can help people here. I'm sure Univista is helping.
Yeah, so both natively and working with our partners. Many of them are on this call today. I mean, it really, like this is a very data-centric issue or data-centric problem, because you're really looking at sets of data and trying to glimpse some insight out of them. And luckily, we live in this big data era now. So all that consumer-facing, Google, artificial intelligence, machine learning buzzwords that you hear, well, they can readily be applied to all of this data that the regulators are collecting. So those of us that have the opportunity to look at data across many firms, we've developed management information and peer comparisons and anonymized aggregations, etc., to be able to spot very quickly that something is off whack. So we can tell the firm before the regulator even does that perhaps there is something funny in the data that they're sending to the regulator, and that might not necessarily imply that somebody's abusing the market or you've overexposed yourself to some derivative. It could be just a data quality problem. But even with that, when the FCA looks at it, they will think that somebody is abusing the market or you're overexposed to some derivative asset class because of the data you're perhaps erroneously sending to them. So I think there is a lot of opportunity here for technology firms to develop solutions that can take the burden off the firms, make it easier to understand where you're at, what the problems are, what you should focus on, etc.
Okay. Lovely. Yeah. Joseph, what would you say from OneTrust perspective? What are the solutions here?
Well, to Tom's point, there's a couple of useful things he mentioned. And first is most firms now have access to a huge amount of computing power should they wish through Amazon Web Services or Azure, whereas previously you would have had to invest in a load of, we call it tin or hardware in the basement and maintain it. But anyone now can spin that up even temporarily and then use it for the period they need, and then if they don't for 6 months or something, just discard that straight away. In terms of OneTrust and sort of platforms in general, a dedicated platform to manage this brings so many benefits, because you can then more proactively manage that data, and also it has the ability to scale. And I would really make the case for considering a dedicated platform, whether it's OneTrust or one of the others, against perhaps an in-house solution or, God forbid, spreadsheets, because in-house solutions and low-tech things like spreadsheets are typically only understood by the person who built them. And then if they move on or transition or resign, the company is in a really difficult position. Whereas a dedicated platform, more often than not, is user-friendly and has a proper user experience or user experience, and has a team of people to support it if you have any challenges. And also, if it's large enough, there's a community of people that are either using it and enjoying it or using it and not enjoying it, but writing about that on the internet, so you can benefit from that too. So I would suggest investigate using a dedicated platform, and also be mindful that you can leverage some of those cloud solutions if you need to crunch the numbers.
Okay, let's see this is a bit second guessing today, isn't it? Let's see the poll results and how organizations are approaching compliance with the new regime. Okay, extended compliance service in the planning stage, some in-house software and some buying additional software, and nobody moving at the moment. Okay, Joseph, that doesn't actually talk specifically about a platform, but what do you think to those poll results?
I think those are probably representative in that if someone is already using a third-party service and they can continue to support that, and they have a good relationship with them, then they would continue to do that. But in the absence of one of those, or perhaps if the relationship isn't perhaps so positive, then maybe consider a platform beyond what you're currently using or a different provider.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Tom, would you say anything about those kind of results, continuing with a service provider being the key one?
Yeah, I mean, we always have this dialogue as to whether an in-house built solution is better than vendor providing solution, and clearly we're a vendor, so we're a bit biased in this, but I think you're just taking on way too much risk if you build it in-house, to be honest. It might seem cheaper, but when you look at the total cost of building it and then the risk that you take on, because you're now interpreting all these very complex regulations that have now doubled because there's a EU version and a UK version, to all the points that were mentioned earlier today. And you now own the interpretation of that and then translation of that into whatever technology you picked, without the community and the expertise of a vendor. I would just say that those firms are brave to take it in-house. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, both of you. And actually coming back to you, Joseph, what further changes do you expect to be made to transaction reporting in the UK and the EU through this year, 2021?
I think in the short term, it's in the UK's interest in particular to try and at least stay aligned. I think it's in their best interest. And from there, I'd expect to see some divergence, but no, I wouldn't expect to see any step changes. Unlike the software industry, where we're constantly seeking to disrupt the market, I think regulation, that's not perhaps their goal. So I think in the immediate term, I don't think there'll be any major changes.
Okay, Melanie, what would you expect over the next year?
So I'm expecting something to happen around EMEA refit specifically, just because that's the sort of next, I think, up and coming big one under EMEA 3.0, if you want, for the transaction reporting section. I think there'll be some alignment or divergence in the SFTR space. Those are really the only ones I can comment on. I think with regards to EMEA, I'm hoping that the Q&A and the refinement around EMEA will start to decrease, just because that will make EMEA refit harder to implement in the long run. So just, it'll be much better. From a MiFID perspective, I really can't speak.
Okay. Silvana, could you speak from a MiFID perspective about potential change?
Actually, yes. There are a number of potential risks. In other words, the EMEA now has a review on MiFID II, especially with the execution quality report that started in 2020, but hasn't finished. So technically, it's not a given that the FCA will follow along. There are also the beginning of conversations around MiFID III from ESMA point of view. So, and it's not a given that the FCA will follow along. So we'll have to watch that space, because logically, if the price is equivalent, the FCA should more or less mirror what ESMA does. If you look at Switzerland, for instance, the regulations have different names, but they don't differ that much in substance. Or you may find one regulation on one side that is two on the other, or whatever. We don't know how the FCA, we don't know how the Treasury will direct the FCA to behave.
Okay.
That is the correct and formal chain of event.
Okay, so plenty more to come, I think, although, as Joseph said, not giant steps, but certainly a little alteration here and there. Excellent. A couple of questions, quick fire round now. Can I ask you, Melanie, and are EU 27 branches of non-EU firms in scope for EMEA reporting?
Sorry, are the EU 27 branches in scope for EMEA refit reporting or EMEA reporting?
I know
I believe it's both. They're both in scope. Branches in general are in scope for the EU.
Okay, lovely. Okay, and here's another one on EMEA, if anybody would like to jump in, and it says, for pre-Brexit EMEA reported swap trades to the EU, are daily valuations for any outstanding positions reportable to UK EMEA for these trades or not, as the trade itself is not being made in the UK? It's a tricky one. No worries. We'll take this down and we'll send it to our sponsors, and somebody will get back to you, who's ever asking the question. We will answer all your questions, but offline later. There are a lot of these double-sided questions, and I think about around an awful lot of aspects of this new regulatory regime. So we will come back on that. But finally, for our experts today, I have one last question. And what advice would you give to data practitioners who are working in this increasingly complex world of transaction reporting? Joseph, would you like to start here?
Certainly, and yes, it was a conversation that Melanie was having earlier, and we were talking about fines. Just because you don't think you'll get fined isn't a reason not to do something. And I mean, you should weigh up that risk. But an organization I was speaking to in the Nordics said, well, our regulator is underfunded, so we don't think we'll get fined. And we were saying, well, is that a good justifiable reason not to implement a privacy program? And they kind of looked at each other and the walls and so on. So don't rely on that as a reason for not doing something, is perhaps what I would say.
Okay, Ron, what would you say in terms of advice for practitioners?
Sure. So it's two quick things. So one of them is that we've talked about, like, technology, but I think the reverse, just don't forget the complete opposite of that. And I think one good way to keep in mind of what's taking place is to speak to your peers, speak to other people, see what other people are doing, and just getting that information from others. And if you have a question, even that one that came up about the swaps, other people have that one as well. And and that's the way to really find that information out. Often that's even better than looking for technology feedback on it. The other one is really, I think it's like a COVID item, and this was really exposed last year in terms of updating reference data. When people started working online, people got sick, unfortunately. There was a lot of gaps that took place on who was responsible for taking place of updating details for reference data for reporting. And I think this is a point that the FCA put out when they put the SMCR a while back, is having those different fallbacks of who's supposed to be responsible and different stages. And I think this is something that people have to have in mind of who's responsible and what are the fallbacks of handling your reporting.
Interesting point. Tom, what would you say here in terms of some guidance for today and the short while?
I think we're all kind of approaching this from a cost perspective and looking at all this regulatory reporting and the infrastructure that we've built as almost a tax of doing business. But I keep thinking that, it forced all of us collectively to kind of put our house in order and standardize all the data that we collect. And there is a lot of value and insight in that data that goes way and above and beyond just the regulatory reporting purpose, So we have firms that want to use the data to profile their brokers and do total cost of ownerships of trades and run it through their trading strategies to see what the possible outcomes would be, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's not just a sunk cost of doing whatever business you want. There's certainly lots of ways that this could be spun into an opportunity. And all that sunk cost and investment, could be leveraged to do other better, perhaps revenue generating things even.
Okay. And Melanie, there you are at the sharp end as a user. What guidance would you give to your colleagues?
Honestly, it kind of feels like we've covered everything. I have very little to add to what these guys have said. I think, like I said earlier, I think the process is important. I'll just steal that from the book. I think the process is important. If we focus on the processes, and I think that's true around data, I think it's true around the regulation in general. If we understand what we're doing, if we focus on the detail, we will get the result right. The other thing I would say, just kind of touching on what Ron has mentioned around peers working together, don't just jump to technology, but work with the industry. We've really seen collaboration in the industry, especially on the SFDR side. I think that's because we were talking about things like pre-matching. I would love to see that on the EMEA refit side, to really pick up, for people to really participate, work together, flesh things through, and for peers to get to know each other, work together, and understand and interpret the regulation to make it easier across the board. I think that's one of the key messages for me, definitely.
Okay, lovely. And a quick word from you, Silvana.
Oh, it's quick. It's what I always say, clean up your data.
Okay, a good start for everything. Absolutely. Okay, thank you. And thank you to all our speakers for sharing their expertise and experience with us today. And thank you to OneTrust, Univista and IHS Markit for sponsoring today's webinar. It's been a good conversation and one that will continue at our virtual RegTech Summit event in June, which includes a focus day on regulatory reporting challenges and priorities. As I mentioned earlier, you can register for that event, the RegTech Summit Virtual, by clicking on the link on your screen. You can also download our latest regulatory data handbook and sign up for our next Brexit webinar on the regulatory landscape and the data management response. We're just going to put up a quick additional poll to gauge interest in live events this year, so please do click on your answer. Otherwise, that's it for today. So thank you again to Melanie, Silvano, Joseph, Ron and Tom. And thank you to all of you who have watched the webinar. Please complete our feedback form as we're always keen to hear from you and improve our webinars. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.